quick review, and I've tried to cram some things in here. So hopefully what I mean comes across. In terms of the location of the story, remember the structure of Numbers can be tracked by the location of the setting. So where does chapter 1 to 10 take place? Mount Sinai. Where does chapters 11 and 12 take place? On the road. And where does chapters 13 to 19 take place? Yeah, the wilderness of Paran, I don't know how you want to say it. That's not the whole book, obviously, but that's where we are up to this point. What's going on in the first 10 chapters? They're at Mount Sinai, we've said that. What's going on in those chapters? Setting stuff up, getting organized, Michael?
Instructions from God.
Instructions from God that are geared towards preparing the people, getting set up to hit the road. Okay, and how does Israel respond to God's instructions in those 10 chapters? They're all over it. They obey everything just as the Lord commanded through Moses. Okay, what is their behavior generally like in chapters 11 to 17? Up to where we are now, that is. Bad behavior, grumbling, complaining. And let's see how many of these you can remember. What's the first complaint? Chapter 11, 1 to 3. Yeah, it's a general complaint. They complain of misfortune or adversity. What's the second complaint? The rest of chapter 11. No meat. Yeah, no meat, and so God gives them quail, more quail than they want. What's the complaint in chapter 12? It is a complaint against Moses made by who? Miriam and Aaron, yeah, his siblings, okay? So that's kind of a unique one there. What's the complaint in chapters 13 and 14? This would be the fourth complaint. And the big one, really. Not Korah yet. Chapter 13 and 14. Yeah, the failure to take the promised land. And then number 5, Cecilio, 16 and 17 is the rebellion of Korah and his folks. So I'm just going to rush through, overview real quick to get us to where we are now tonight in chapter 18. First 10 chapters, organization, instruction, getting the people ready to leave. Then in chapter 10, they hit the road. And you have stories of complaining, which we've already talked about. Okay? Then, once they get to the wilderness of Paran, they have this episode that dooms the first generation for the rest of their time in the wilderness. The spies look at the land, they come back and say, good land, but strong people. And that fear causes the people in chapter 14 to rebel. God wants to basically wipe them all out, but Moses intercedes. They are forgiven, and yet they are doomed again, condemned to die in the wilderness. So they will wander for 40 years, and none of them will make it into the land except for Tonight we will see, not Moses, surprisingly, but Joshua and Caleb will make it in, only them of that first generation.
You said you're trying to hurry, but
it's okay.
I'm going to ask anyway. Why were they so calm when they were at Sinai, and then once they left, they started going crazy, complaining about everything? Why was that?
It's a good question. We've talked about it some, and to me, some of it's got to be the difficulty of it. When you're stable and kind of camping out in one place, that's easy. Once things get hard, then you're, apt to complain. I also think maybe to that point, there's more trust involved, right? When you go out on the road and things are difficult, and you face, like, for instance, going in the promised land, and you see the giants, you see it's easier to obey and even to trust when, again, things are easy and you're not asked to make as big of a leap in terms of what God expects of you. But to go up against a giant or an army of giants, or to go up against a fortified city as basically a band of slaves that have just come out of Egypt, there's a bigger trust involved. God has demonstrated his ability to do big things, but still for them, there's that bigger gap, for instance, that they have to trust in, and they don't get there. Yep.
Are we that much different? Once we get out of our comfort zone and we get into a strange land, are we that much different?
Paul says we're not that different at all, and that's why we need to be on guard. Yeah. Brian, did you want to jump in, or did we?
I'm just going to say that the Hebrew writer says that they died in the wilderness because of disbelief.
Yeah.
And then later, he says because of sin, and therefore what you have is disbelief leading to sin. Their faith was tested by adversity and afflictions, just as we are. Instead of being strong and endure and persevere and overcoming, they rebelled against God, and they perished in the wilderness and weren't allowed entrance into the promised land.
And we'll look at that passage tonight in the book of Hebrews. So again, New Testament writers are very clear. We better learn the lessons of the wilderness. Good. We talked about this last week. Remember that in the book of Numbers, there's all this kind of different material mixed together, and there's a lot of laws, instructions, flyover country, we might think of it as we're reading through our Bibles. But there's also these really great stories. And one of the things I've tried to do in this class is make sure that each time we're together in class, we have at least one of those stories to read and dig into, because it's more engaging. As we've said, there's plenty of applications, and I want to make sure we sink our teeth into that. And so we kind of overview instructions and then dig into the stories. But as I said before, these stories and the instructions are not just thrown together haphazardly or randomly, but they are kind of tied together with a very specific purpose. So for instance, in this instance, from chapter 13 to 15, you have the two chapters, the story of the people failing to get the promised land, which was what God had ready for them. And he says, you're all going to die in the wilderness. But just as all kind of seems lost, then in chapter 15, God gives all these instructions for offering sacrifices in the promised land. So there's a note of hope there that you are going to make it one of these days. Once you do, I'm going to be faithful. I'm going to keep my promise. Once you get in there, this is how you make those offerings. And that brings us into the section that we're in right now, from chapters 16 to 19, where you have the rebellion of Korah in chapter 16. Remember that Korah was a Levite. He had a very special duty. All the Levites did, about serving in the tabernacle, and yet Korah and his friends wanted more. They weren't content with their position, with their role, and so they objected to Moses and Aaron's leadership. They rebelled. The people rebelled with them. They were swallowed up in the earth, and God demonstrated through that and through the budding of Aaron's rod that Aaron was the guy and that his family were going to be the priest. So what we'll see now is that following that story, we have instructions for the priests and the Levites, specifically, as we will see, instructions that differentiate between the role of the priests and the role of the Levites. So you see how that works together. You have a story about a Levite who is trying to usurp his role and challenge the priest. That rebellion is put down. Following that is instructions about, okay, here's what the Levite's job is, here's what the priest's job is. And then in chapter 19, we'll see some instructions for purification. So let's jump into that. And then the plan is to get through this with enough time to read and discuss the story in chapter 20, which there will be a lot to talk about there. Chapter 18, let's actually read the first 7 verses and notice the duties that are given to the Levites and the priests. Notice in verse 1 of chapter 18, the Lord said to Aaron, so that's important because in this passage here, God is talking to Aaron. So when he says, you shall do X, Y, Z, that means the priests, the family of Aaron. When he says, they shall do X, Y, Z, he's talking about the Levites, who, as we see, will be the helpers of the priests. So notice the difference. You shall, they shall, what the priest's job was, what the Levite's job was. Chapter 18 of Numbers, verse 1. So the Lord said to Aaron, you and your sons and your father's household with you shall bear the guilt in connection with the sanctuary, and you and your sons with you shall bear the guilt in connection with your priesthood. But bring with you also your brothers, the tribe of Levi, the tribe of your father, that they may be joined with you and serve you, while you and your sons with you are before the tent of testimony. Verse 3, and they shall thus attend to your obligation and the obligation of all the tent, but they shall not come near to the furnishings of the sanctuary and the altar, or both they and you will die. They shall be joined with you and attend to the obligations of the tent of meeting, for all the service of the tent, but an outsider may not come near you. so you shall attend to the obligations of the sanctuary and the obligations of the altar, so that there will no longer be wrath on the sons of Israel. Behold, I myself have taken your fellow Levites from among the sons of Israel. They are a gift to you, dedicated to the Lord, to perform the service of the tent of meeting. But you and your sons with you shall attend to your priesthood for everything concerning the altar and inside the veil, and you are to perform service. I am giving you the priesthood as a bestowed service, but the outsider who comes near shall be put to death. Okay, what do you see as the distinct duties here between the priests and the Levites? How would you explain that based on these verses? What do you see, Brian? Michael, why don't you kick us off and then bring the mic up to Brian?
The priests are to, it says, bear iniquity. But the Levites, it talks about guarding over the tent. So that's one.
Okay, thank you. Brian, what are you going to say about that?
I'd summarize it more broadly is that Aaron and his sons were the priests that served in the tabernacle, in the holy place. They offered their sacrifices, those priestly duties, and then the remainder of the sons of Levi were the, lack of a better word, the administrators, the ones who did the maintenance and attended to the furnishings and carried the tabernacle and so forth.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Anything else you notice here about the difference between the Levites and the priests in terms of their roles and responsibilities? Okay, I think we've basically captured it here. Michael referred to this language in verse 1 that the priests were to bear the guilt, right? Bear the guilt in connection with the sanctuary, bear the guilt in connection with the priesthood. Essentially, their job is to deal with the sin of the people, right? They are standing between God and the people of Israel. As Brian mentioned, they offer the sacrifices to the Lord. They working in the sanctuary to offer worship, offer sacrifices to make atonement for the sins of the people. That, I think we're familiar with that, is the priest's job. But the Levites kind of do the work that's necessary for that work of atonement to take place. So Brian mentions administrating, serving in the tabernacle. Michael mentions the guarding of that. We've seen that language already in Numbers. And to me, this is interesting because, you know, we talked about this some with Korah. It would be easy to look at this and say, well, the priests do the real work, right? The priests do the worship and the atonement. That's the important stuff. The Levites, who really cares? But you notice in this passage, God is describing to Aaron that this is a critical role that each of them have to play. It reminds me, maybe a parallel passage in the New Testament will be something like Acts 6. Remember, the early church in Jerusalem is just getting going, and there's this problem with the widows, the Greek cultured widows that are being neglected in the offering. And the apostles say, hey, we need to be busy with the ministry of the word and with prayer. We don't have time to take care of these widows. Is it because it's unimportant work? Well, no. But the apostles had their role that they were to do as the leaders in the early church of Jerusalem. And so they appointed men, deacons. Well, they're not called deacons, but they're kind of like proto-deacons in that passage to take care of that responsibility so that the widows could be taken care of and the apostles could continue their work of ministering to the word, ministering the word and prayer, intercessory prayer, among other things, for the church. And so you see that same basic idea here, that the priests have their work for the atonement, for the iniquity of the people, to offer those sacrifices, to offer that worship. The Levites have this critical role of doing all the things that are supporting the priests and allowing them to do that work. And the same thing would be true today, right? We shouldn't think of just one group of people, like the elders or the preachers, that are doing the work, and the rest of us just kind of sit around and, watch them do it, okay? Everything that any one of us does to serve others and to make the work possible and to make things happen, it's all part of this kind of important and valuable intertwined work and service that we all offer in the Lord. And we've already talked about Korah and the warning of not being content with the work that's been given to us. Okay, Yeah, Brian.
It's pretty obvious here that the priests, according to the line of Aaron, were held responsible for the Levites carrying out their duties, and if they violated the rules that the law that God set down, the priests were held accountable along with the Levites.
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is the same in the church. And
Sure.
the deacons do a lot of the work, but who's ultimately responsible?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Brian. All right. Let's move through the rest of this more quickly. In the rest of chapter 18, you have the provisions or the portion, basically how the priests and then the Levites are going to be supported, taken care of, fed, and their work that they are doing. And so in chapter 18, verses 8 to 20, we read about the priest's portion. Notice in verse 8, there's this interesting language that God says, I myself have given you charge of my offerings, even all the holy gifts of the sons of Israel I have given to you as a portion, and to the sons of Israel, and to your sons as a perpetual allotment, right? So who were the offerings for that were made? Who are these offerings? Offerings brought to the tabernacle. Who are they for? And you see how those two things they don't rule each other out, okay? Think about what Jesus says in Matthew 25. As much as you did this for the least of these my brethren, you did it for me. You can give something to somebody else, and you've given a gift to God, right? You see that kind of idea here. These offerings to God were also helping out the priests and feeding them. And through the rest of this passage, there's different details about what they would receive, restrictions for what they would receive and where to eat it, how to eat it, all that kind of stuff. But in verse 20, the end of this section, God tells Aaron, you shall have no inheritance in the land, meaning you don't get, like the other tribes, land for yourself. And so they wouldn't be able to farm, they wouldn't be able to grow their crops, and so, although there was some stipulations for that later on in the law. But basically they would not receive land because God would be their portion, and God would take care of them through the offerings that were brought by the people of Israel. Okay, the rest of chapter 18 is the provision for the Levites. To me, this is interesting. The people of Israel were supposed to tithe, and that tithe would be used to support the Levites. Verse 21 and verse 24 both make that clear. Like the priests, the Levites don't have an inheritance in the land, and so they live off the tithes that are brought by the Israelites. But then in verse 28, God tells the Levites, you got to pay tithes too. So they receive the offering of tithes from the people, but then they themselves have to participate like everybody else in offering what they've been given to God and showing Him honor and gratitude in that way. Okay, that's chapter 18, duties of Levites and priests and the provisions for each of those groups of people. Chapter 19 is a very strange chapter, in part because the instructions here are not mentioned anywhere else in the law of Moses. And it has to do with a red heifer. I didn't know what a heifer was. I knew it was a cow, I guess. But you learn stuff when you study the Bible, So a heifer is like a young female cow, right? And so what they were to do was to have this red heifer slaughtered outside the camp. Well, let me back up a little bit. It appears as if this chapter and the instructions in chapter 19 are a way of offering purification to people, perhaps when the tabernacle was not accessible. So if you imagine that there would be times when you're packing up, moving, or setting up, and the tabernacle's not yet assembled, if you're moving through the wilderness, or it's, being moved or something, and there's a purification that needs to happen, but the tabernacle's not set up. Or perhaps if someone can't get to the tabernacle, maybe this is a way of offering cleansing in those cases as well. I don't know, okay, is the kind of answer to that. But basically, the first 10 verses of this chapter describe a slaughtering, a ceremony in which a red heifer, red perhaps to symbolize blood, which would be significant. The heifer is slaughtered and burned completely, and there are other kind of things added to the mixture to burn it and create these ashes. The ashes would then be harvested, And then the rest of the chapter describes how you would take those ashes and mix it with fresh water, and then use that mixture to purify people who had different uncleannesses, right? Most of it has to do with the touching of a dead body, or the tents or the furniture that would become unclean because of contact with a dead body, okay? And I know these are the kinds of chapters you read. Again, you work through it in your daily Bible reading, and you wonder, why in the world is this chapter in the Bible? What was God thinking when he included this? And these are good questions to ask. But in a chapter like this, as is typical, as we've seen in Leviticus, as we've seen in Numbers, there's always shadows of Christ that we could be looking for. Again, the color red and the significance of blood for purification. The fact that this heifer is slaughtered outside the camp. We talked about that some with the Day of Atonement and the book of Leviticus, that Christ himself suffered outside the camp, and Hebrews 13 picks up on that language to talk about him as our atoning sacrifice. The significance of water mixed with the ashes, and the water in baptism cleansing sins in the New Testament, as well as water being a picture of the Holy Spirit and the work of sanctification in the New Testament as well. So all of these symbols, however weird they are to us, point forward to the work of God in Jesus, and there are lessons to be learned for us in that as well. Okay, well, let's move on to chapter 20. Unless there's anything else, you may have big questions about the red heifer. We can stop. We can talk about it. No, Granny, you're good? All right. So let's do chapter 20. And you'll notice with that, maybe you missed it. We'll do it again. So the moving circle there. We are now closing the book on the section in the wilderness of Paran. Notice if you have your Bible open in chapter 20 there, it says in chapter 20, verse 1, that the whole congregation came to the wilderness of Zin. You'll notice in verse 14 of the chapter, they sent messengers to the king of Edom. Verse 22, they set out from Kadesh, the sons of Israel. So we are now back into a traveling section here, where they are on the road and moving through the wilderness, having left the wilderness of Paran. And the first of these two chapters in the section of traveling here, chapter 20, has quite a few things going on that we will, I think, want to talk about. So let's read the whole chapter and then talk about what's going on here in Numbers chapter 20. Read with me here, Numbers 20, beginning in verse 1. Now the sons of Israel, the whole congregation, came to the wilderness of Sin in the first month, and the people stayed at Kadesh. Now Miriam died there and was buried there. There was no water for the congregation, and they all assembled themselves against Moses and Aaron. The people thus contended with Moses and spoke, saying, "If only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why then have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness for us and our beasts to die here? Why have you made us come up from Egypt to bring us into this wretched place? Is it not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates? Nor is there water to drink." Then Moses and Aaron came in from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, verse 8, "Take the rod, and you and your brother Aaron assemble the congregation and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it may yield its water. You shall thus bring forth water for them out of the rock, and let the congregation and their beasts drink." So Moses took the rod from before the Lord, just as he had commanded them. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock, and he said to them, "Listen now, you rebels, shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came forth abundantly, and the congregation and their beasts drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you have not believed me, to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them." Those were the waters of Meribah, because the sons of Israel contended with the Lord, and he proved himself holy among them. Verse 14, from Kadesh Moses then sent messengers to the king of Edom. "Thus your brother Israel has said, you know all the hardship that has befallen us, that our fathers went down to Egypt, and we stayed in Egypt a long time, and the Egyptians treated us and our fathers badly. But when we cried out to the Lord, he heard our voice and sent an angel and brought us out from Egypt. Now behold, we are at Kadesh, a town at the edge of your country. Please let us pass through your land. We will not pass through field or through vineyard. We will not even drink water from a well. We will go along the king's highway, not turning to the right or left until we pass through your territory. Edom, however, said to him, You shall not pass through us, or I will come out with a sword against you. Again, the sons of Israel said to him, We will go up by the highway, and if I and my livestock do drink any of your water, I will pay its price. Let me only pass through on my feet, nothing else. But he said, You shall not pass through. And Edom came out against him with a heavy force and with a strong hand. Thus Edom refused to allow Israel to pass through his territory, so Israel turned away from him. Now when they set out from Kadesh, the sons of Israel, the whole congregation, came to Mount Hor. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron at Mount Hor by the border of the land of Edom, saying, Aaron will be gathered to his people, for he shall not enter the land which I have given to the sons of Israel, because you rebelled against my command at the waters of Meribah. Take Aaron and his son Eleazar and bring them to Mount Hor, and strip Aaron of his garments and put them on his son Eleazar. So Aaron will be gathered to his people and will die there. So Moses did just as the Lord had commanded, and they went up to Mount Hor in the sight of all the congregation. After Moses had stripped Aaron of his garments and put them on his son Eleazar, Aaron died there on the mountaintop. Then Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain. When all the congregation saw that Aaron had died, all the house of Israel wept for Aaron for 30 days. Okay, a lot going on in this chapter here. You tell me, what are some of the things that happen in this action-packed account? Aaron dies. Miriam dies. Moses sins. A new high priest takes over. Edom refuses the passage of the people. Okay. By the way, who is Edom? Yeah, I don't know if you noticed that. In that section, it's kind of weird when you read it. It sounds like it's two people talking. One person named Israel, one person named Edom. It's like the way that the author, Moses, wrote that. It's like kind of in the singular. Israel says to Edom, probably like a messenger taking word to the king of Edom, but in reality, going back, it was two brothers. Esau became the patriarch of the people of Edom, the Edomites, and his brother, twin brother, Jacob, or Israel, fathered the Israelites. But the brother, Edom, refuses passage to his brother, Israel. And then one other thing we didn't mention, it's related to why Moses sins. Well, not why he sinned, but well, they wept for 30 days after the death of Aaron, yes. What is it that causes the whole debacle with Moses? Yeah, another complaint. Yeah. Yes, a repeat of Exodus 17 and the complaining about water. Okay, good. So here's what we got. These 5 basic events that we have described. So my question for you that I want you to discuss with each other. In some ways, I see here in this one chapter, Numbers 20, it's like a microcosm of the whole book of Numbers, right? Like all the things we've talked about in Numbers, so many of them kind of come out and or come to a head here in Numbers chapter 20. So that's my question for you to discuss for a minute, and then we'll share out. Where do you see here in chapter 20 all the stuff we've been talking about in Numbers? How does this one chapter encapsulate so much of what's been happening in the book up to this point? Talk about that for a couple minutes, if that question makes any sense, and then we'll share out very shortly. Together, what do you see in this chapter? What do you see in Numbers 20 that demonstrates, reflects what we've was seen throughout the story of Numbers up to this point? Let's let somebody else jump in here. Xavier?
And God's just, thank you, Michael. God's just working on these the destinations these people think they want to be at. God's just trying to work through them. And so these don't seem like good journeys or good destinations from where I'm sitting, but they're all journeys and destinations. And so I think that kind of encapsulates the story of Numbers so far.
Thank you, Xavier. Journeys and destinations. I appreciate that. What else do you see here in Numbers 20? Go ahead. We'll get Brian and then Michael. I
I mean,
flip-flopped it
I
earlier.
won't get all of them in there, but with Moses in particular, with his failure, in Numbers we see initial obedience and then not obeying, and then the repercussions of that. And this is the second time that this has kind of happened. And the first time Moses obeyed God, and the second time he didn't. So I just saw that pattern.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Pattern of initial obedience and then disobedience later. Brian?
I see the pattern of judges falling away, rebelling, and then intercession and satisfying God's anger against them. And then you also see the consequences of sin because both Aaron and Moses were denied entrance into the promised land, just like the unbelieving, sinful nation as well.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Pattern of the judges from sin to intercession, the consequences of those sins. Other Brian? Or the real Brian?
Seeing continued problems that the Israelites have with the current inhabitants of the land. When the spies went out, there was concern and fear of the inhabitants that currently occupied the land, and here they're coming up against a neighboring kingdom, and they're having trouble with that king allowing them a simple passage through their land.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, trouble with the current inhabitants of the land as before with the spies. Thank you. Yeah, Albert.
By people of the world, say Edom/Israel, that don't believe in God's strength and power and capability, and then you see his own people waver with faith and then fall aside in at least a little adversity, and so I just keep seeing a pattern of not ever allowing themselves to understand God, his strength and his power, and that he is the creator.
Failure, not allowing themselves, interesting, to trust and to rely on God's power through the adversity that will inevitably come, right? Yeah, Mike, I thought you said you were done.
I was. Okay. No, I can't be quiet. The water complaint, still complaining, still saying, what'd you bring us out here to let us die? I mean, how many times have we heard that ever since they left Egypt? And then the hostility side, I thought real quick of Korah and that group being hostile towards Moses and all that type of good stuff. So,
No, thank you. As Xavier said, right, Numbers is a road story. And remember, the Hebrew name of the book of Numbers is in the wilderness, right? Which is not quite on the road, but it has that kind of sense of it, right? That Numbers is all about this journey. And any story in the Bible or otherwise about a literal journey is also about a spiritual journey or a journey of character. And God is leading his son, Israel, on this journey, not just literally from Sinai to the promised land, but trying to help his child Israel to grow up, to learn, and ultimately, as has been said multiple times, to trust in him, okay? And a large part of that process has been the adversity that is inevitably going to come, right? And you see, again, as you all said, the complaining, the failure to trust in God and kind of wilt in the face of adversity. And that just continues time and time and time and time again. The Edom story, though, is interesting because you don't necessarily see in that story that they are complaining about that or rebelling because they're now having to go the long way, all the way around Edom. So in some ways, the story of Edom is kind of just, this is life on the road. This is life when God leads you through the wilderness. There's inevitably going to be difficulty. Sometimes you have somebody who should be treating you right that treats you wrong. That's unfortunate. But God just leads his people on a little bit of a roundabout way. And again, there's not a whole lot of commentary given in this story here. But maybe from the lack of statement about rebelling and complaining, they just went along with what God was doing with them or how he was leading them. Maybe, to Brian's point, they were too scared of the Edomites and they were relieved when they didn't have to go through Edom. I don't know. But God is leading them through the wilderness. He is leading them on this journey. And he is trying to get them to trust in him. But of course, the major theme in the book of Numbers is the people's failure to trust in him. And the result of that is that all of them are dying in the wilderness and giving way to the next generation. And this chapter right here encapsulates that theme very clearly, because Moses doesn't actually die in this chapter, but his death is announced. His doom is determined here because of his failure to obey and to trust in God. And so in this one chapter, we have Miriam's death, we have Aaron's death, and we have Moses doomed to die. This is the first generation saying goodbye and passing the garments, at least, to Robert's point, to the next generation, to a new high priest, and to the next Israelites who will go into the promised land. Okay, we didn't talk much about Moses. Anybody upset with God's judgment of Moses? Who is it that's... Oh, Michael said, Moses had done everything right up to this point. One slip up, boom, no promised land. Anybody not happy with that? Brian, you're not happy with it?
But I'll let you go.
No, go ahead. I'm looking for your thoughts.
Well, under the old law, in the Old Testament, as we call it, you have a physical representation of the spiritual realities that you have in the New. And so we see where Moses was condemned and not allowed entrance into the promised land, which is a representation of heaven for us. But Moses spiritually was entered into the kingdom of heaven, because we see him with Jesus at the transfiguration. He is a major figure in the spiritual realm. So he didn't die of sin. He was punished for sin in the physical life.
Thank you, Brian. And I do think that is an important clarification. I don't know if we've talked about it in Numbers, so to speak, but it is important to keep in mind, especially in the Old Testament, that a judgment of God that involves the physical death of people is not necessarily equated to their eternal condemnation, right? And this would be maybe the prime example of that with Moses. The consequence of his sin is that he will not go into the promised land. But obviously the Bible counts Moses, if they are ranked, which maybe we're not supposed to rank them, as among the truest servants of God. And he is the self-proclaimed meekest man that ever walked the face of the earth. John Albert?
That I think the use of it saying that in God's condemnation towards Moses and Aaron, but him saying, because you have not believed me, that it reminds me back to whenever Moses, we go all the way back to the beginning of this story in Exodus, and him starting, and then that was a huge aspect that Moses was not believing God, that he was the right person to begin this whole story that we've read about, that we've studied up to this point, that it's almost like it's a regression for Moses, and I think it's a warning to us that no matter how far along we might be in our journey of the wilderness, there is always the opportunity for us to fall back to old patterns, to fall backwards in faith, to lose what we've grown with, how we have grown, and it's just a warning to us all that no matter where we are in that journey, it's something that we need to be cautious of, protect ourselves against.
That's very interesting, John Albert. Thank you. And I hadn't thought about that, but John Albert brings up the very beginning of Moses. Well, not the beginning. Seems like the 40 years in the wilderness, his first 40 years in the wilderness is a humbling experience, right? Moses goes from strutting out of Pharaoh's palace, murdering an Egyptian, thinking that all the Israelites are just going to follow him when he stands up, waves his hand, and says, "I'm your deliverer." They don't want to follow him, so he runs away. He's 40 years in the wilderness. Then God is able to use him, but at that point, he's like, "No, I'm not the guy, right? Don't choose me. I can't talk, right? And I don't have the skills, whatever." And that may be related to the statement in Numbers 12, which, to be clear, I don't think Moses actually wrote it. I think someone else wrote that comment that he was the meekest man to ever, live on the earth. That is a defining characteristic of Moses, is his meekness. And in so many, if not all of these complaints that we've seen, when people complain against Moses, they object about his leadership. What does he do? falls on his face before God. Almost always, he's not actually saying anything to the people who have made the complaint or who have objected about his leadership. He takes it straight to God and says, God, this is in your hands, right? You take care of it. That's what it means for him to be meek. He takes all of this before God. It's not about him. And yet, what does Moses say here in Numbers chapter 20 when he goes to the rock? In verse 10. Shall we bring water from this rock for you rebels? I think we see something different in Moses here. Maybe you say, hey, I get it, man. These people had put him through the ringer. That may be true, okay? But we see Moses departing from his typical meekness and maybe taking on, to John Albert's point, regressing toward a prideful spirit, a boastful spirit. And of course, out of that prideful and boastful spirit comes the disobedience that, of course, we don't want to overlook, that he was told to do one thing and he did something else. To Michael's point, he struck the rock back in Exodus 17 as God commanded him. Here he's told to speak to the rock, and I think the striking of it and that act of disobedience, hand in hand with the kind of rash, angry, prideful statement of, shall we bring forth water from this rock for you rebels? All of that is kind of goes together. So, a few minutes ago when I was tongue-in-cheek saying, hey, is anybody upset with this? I think part of the reason why this doesn't sit well with us is because we don't have a proper understanding of the gravity of Moses' sin here, right? We maybe see it like we try to see all of our sins as, oh, he messed up, right? He made a mistake. No, what Moses does here is egregious, not only because of the disobedience of God's direct command, but because of the prideful spirit with which he does it. And so, of course, God is just. And even if we can't rationalize or understand, we know that God is just. And he gives this condemnation to Moses, who will, before the end of the book of Numbers, pass the torch to Joshua. And Joshua will lead the people in instead of Moses. Okay. We'll maybe come back to Psalm 95 and Hebrews 3 and 4 next week. We're doing good in terms of pacing for the class, so I'm not worried about that. Keep going in Numbers between now and next Wednesday, and then let's do our review real quickly. Where does this section of Numbers take place? Chapters 13 and 19. Where does it take place? Yes, that's right. On the earth. 13 to 19. Where does it take place? Paran, however you want to say it. All right, go through the complaints. What's the big one in chapters 13 and 14? Failing the promised land, okay? What instructions come after that in chapter 15? Maybe this is unfair because this was part of our review. Chapter 15 is instructions about living in the promised land and offering sacrifices. What's the complaint of chapters 16 and 17? Leadership. The complaint is made by Korah, right? And the instructions that follow in chapter 18 and 19, remember these go together because Korah was a Levite, so the instructions in chapters 18 and 19 are about the priests and the Levites, okay? And then who dies in chapter 20? Everyone. It's like the Hunger Games, man. Everybody dies. Miriam, Aaron, and for all intents and purposes, Moses as well. Okay, cool. We'll pick up there next Wednesday. Thanks, guys.